Well, thank you for joining another episode of Traveling Through History. And we're really happy you're here this week. We have a really exciting episode for you. This is something I'm very passionate about, and that is the espionage of the American Revolution, or the spies that made the American Revolution go. As many of you probably know, that warfare often is decisive off the battlefield, and it's often decisive when it comes to the spying that goes on, the misinformation, the propaganda, the spy networks that pick up the critical information at the right time. And no one knew this more than George Washington and his leaders of the Continental Army. Many years earlier, George Washington had learned the hard way in the French and Indian Wars when he was a British officer, and had found out very in a difficult way through those battles that he didn't have the information he needed. He didn't know where the French troops were. He didn't know where the Indian troops were. Didn't know what kind of number they had, what kind of condition they were in. And he vowed to himself back then, through some of his wins and losses in those battles, that he would never make that mistake again. So when he got to the Revolutionary War, as commander, he decided that he was going to set up major spy networks throughout the continental colonies. We'll talk about several of those in this episode today. I have a lot of really good information I've been researching for this episode. So we're going to talk about those spy networks. We're going to talk about some of the individuals that made up those spy networks, some of the really fascinating and interesting individuals and events that happened, and the individuals that made up that cohort of spy rings that really were decisive in favor of the Continental Army and George Washington and his men. So really excited to show you that. Then we're going to go through a short video, and we'll talk about what we learned in that video on the other side of it. And then we're going to talk about, as always in this program, a really exciting segment we do, which is the 25 little known facts. And this time it'll be a special 25 little known facts about the spy networks and the spies of the American Revolution. So very excited to tell you about that. So in a way, the American Revolution began with acts of espionage, even a month before the shot that was heard around the world, which was in Concord and Lexington up in Massachusetts. Thomas Gage, who was the royal governor of Massachusetts, sent two subordinates to travel to Concord in March of 1775 to gather information about the Patriots' intentions, their stockpiles and supplies of weapons. So the British knew this was coming. They had intelligence, and they needed to gather more to find out what the Continental Army was doing. When British troops finally headed to Concord in April, their march was hardly a surprise, and it was very much intentional what they were doing. Did someone close to the royal governor potentially give the Patriots some heads up as to their approach? Probably so. There was espionage going on both sides. So during the American Revolution itself, both British and Patriot armies employed spies to gather information about the enemy, both at the front lines and behind the front lines. Both armies relied on spies that were typically just regular, normal citizens. These were shop owners. These were farmers. These were people that were in high society. These were even sometimes slaves. These were folks that were just ordinary folks that were trying to help out one side or the other to gather information. They often would try to find out the numbers of troops, the movement of troops, how many munitions each side had, what were their plans, where their strategic movements going to be, where were they going to try to attack, where were they amassing forces. Those are the types of things they were trying to do. The British commanders found intelligence gathered by loyalist sympathizers throughout the Northeast and even around Maryland and Virginia. So that was how they were gathering their information, through a number of networks. The Americans did the same. They were employing people that were just normal folks in normal society around New York City, around Philadelphia, around Maryland and Virginia, even all the way down to Georgia. They were using these networks of individuals. We'll be talking in detail today about the major network George Washington had in the New York area, which was called the Culper Spy Ring. And we'll spend some time on them. We'll go through each of the individual contributors to that Culper Spy Ring. It was a very successful ring. It busted a lot of different big plots that the British were planning to attack the Continental Army on, and also try to gain an advantage. And some of the big things that the Culper Spy Ring did, it outed Benedict Arnold as the greatest traitor. He had been a hero to the Continental Army, and he had been one of George Washington's top generals. But then, of course, he was a turncoat about midway through the war, and the Culper Spy Ring busted that plot. They also busted John Andre, who was the head of intelligence for the Brits out of New York City. They got him captured, and actually he ended up being hung later. They also found out a bunch of other plots that the Brits were planning, and passed that along to George Washington. And we'll talk about some of the detailed ways that they did that. It was really interesting, exciting to watch. In the end, the revolutionary spies that we're going to talk about today were decisive for the colonials, and they made it so that they could defeat the greatest army in the world at that time. They would not have done so otherwise without the rings that they put together and the information that they were getting on a regular basis. So we'll talk some more about that and how it was decisive. As we mentioned, George Washington was keenly aware of the importance of espionage during the war. In 1777, he actually wrote to Colonel Elias Dayton that it was necessary to procure good intelligence, and apparent need cannot be further urged. All that remains for me to add is that you can keep the whole matter as secret as possible. He also, at the time, asked Congress specifically for funds for these operations, and he received, over the course of the war, a total of 11% of the overall congressional budget went to spy operations. So that shows you how important Washington and his men thought it was to just be getting information. I would also mention that not only did he want to get information, but he wanted to spread misinformation, and George Washington became a master of that. He would often spread rumors and lies and things that were not really going to happen through men that he thought might be compromised, and in many cases they were. And that information would often get to the Brits, and the Brits would make a mistake off of bad information. So George Washington was a master at misinformation as well, and propaganda. At the end of the war, when the colonials finally won and we finally got our independence from England, one of the main British generals said, essentially, Washington did not outfight the British. He outspied the British. And that was very much true. Like I said before, the decisive reason that we obtained our independence as a country was because of spying. So let's go ahead and take a look at a quick video we're going to talk about on the other side, and there's some real interesting information here.
This video is brought to you by Captivating History. The Culper Ring was a crucial part of the American Revolutionary War. This complex network of spies undermined British military efforts and allowed the American patriots to prepare in advance against incoming attacks. Many men and women attached to the ring risked their lives to sneak secret information out of British-occupied New York. Despite its many achievements, the Culper Ring's existence only became known to the general public in the early 20th century. During the summer of 1776, at the beginning of the War for Independence, British forces dealt a devastating blow to the American rebels by capturing New York City. The Americans would not regain the city for 7 long years, and General George Washington was forced to carry out a bitter retreat. Many of those close to Washington pushed for him to burn the city to the ground. Although New York was not yet the mighty metropolis it would become, it was already a great city, populated by tens of thousands of people. It was a natural trading port that would prove valuable to the British, providing them with a vital supply line. After Congress came out against the measure, it was decided they would have to find another way to counteract the British in the region. Washington was particularly enthusiastic about building a competent intelligence network, and New York became his primary target, although his early, less organized intelligence efforts often failed. One of the best known of these early attempts was the expedition of Nathan Hale. Nathan Hale was a soldier and member of the Rangers, and when he heard that Washington was looking for spies, he volunteered. His attempt to infiltrate New York would serve as a test run for later espionage efforts, including the Culper Ring. To get into New York, Hale crossed the Sound, the stretch of water that separates Connecticut from Long Island. The Long Island Sound was a weak spot during the war, and it was frequently used by spies and smugglers on both sides. Hale entered New York disguised as a traveling teacher, but he made the mistake of divulging his plans to a man employed by the British. Hale was hanged after uttering his immortal last words, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." The Patriots were devastated. Washington, mindful of the failure of Nathan Hale, looked to create a new, watertight intelligence operation in the city. One of the first men to come on board was a former classmate of Nathan Hale's from Yale University, Benjamin Talmadge. Talmadge had not only lost Hale to the British, his brother also had recently died on a British prison ship. In time, Talmadge would become the leader of the Culper Ring. But initially, he was put on the payroll of a man named Nathaniel Sackett. Sackett had been given a budget by Washington to recruit spies in New York. Talmadge ran messages to Washington, but Sackett's operation was ineffective, and it quickly collapsed for reasons unknown. After a brief hiatus, Washington received a message from a former whaler named Caleb Brewster. Brewster believed he could help Washington gather intelligence in New York using his whaling boats, and the now experienced Talmadge was sent to help Brewster create a new spy ring. And so it was that the Culper Ring was born. Aware of the heavy burden that fell upon him, Talmadge would not copy the reckless techniques of past operatives, but would instead pursue a more careful form of espionage. Instead of appointing military men, Talmadge used a farmer, Abraham Woodhull, as the ring's first key operative. Woodhull didn't seem likely to be a spy, and his sister lived in New York City, so his movements didn't look too suspicious. Woodhull himself was given an alias, Samuel Culper, which gave the spy ring its name. When in the city, Woodhull successfully recruited several spies without a hitch, and they began gathering crucial intelligence. Some of these operatives were women, as they typically raised less suspicion among the British, who were generally on the lookout for male agents. One of the most important female members was known as Agent 355, who some historians now believe was a local woman named Anna Strong. Anna's husband had been arrested early in the war for working with the Patriots, and it is possible she remained in Long Island to take up espionage herself. A system was soon worked out using Brewster's boats. Brewster would regularly meet Woodhull at a series of secluded coves in Setauket, Long Island. He would pick up the information he needed, then head back across the Sound to Talmadge. Anna Strong would leave several handkerchiefs on her clothesline to indicate which particular cove was the meeting point each day. As time passed, the ring's methods became more sophisticated. Because time was of the essence to ensure that the information given was accurate and relevant, Talmadge recruited couriers to speed things up. The group also began to use dead drops, agreed upon secret locations to stash intelligence. Couriers would visit these dead drops and deliver their contents to Woodhull in Setauket. To maintain secrecy, the group increasingly found ways to conceal what was in their notes. A system of codes was created which replaced keywords with numbers. General Washington was 711. Talmadge was 721. A list of these codes was then compiled into a book given out to key Culper Ring members. The ring also used invisible ink to write their messages, writing these hidden messages between the lines of innocuous letters or on the back of pamphlets and other documents. Initially, most invisible inks, including those used by the British, consisted of a mixture of lemon juice and water that, when lightly heated, would reveal a message. However, the Patriots, helped by a British physician, produced a new kind of invisible ink that was harder to crack. When a particular chemical was applied to the paper, the message would be revealed. While the Culper Ring's careful and ingenious processes made them one of the most successful spying operations of the entire Revolutionary War, they had several close calls that almost busted their whole operation. In 1779, a local privateer, in trouble with the British authorities, desperately looked for a way to evade punishment. To secure his parole, he alerted the British that Abraham Woodhull was up to no good. British soldiers promptly showed up at Woodhull's home, but Woodhull was out, so the soldiers set about beating his father instead. Woodhull was fortunate to escape. He was never actually arrested because his family was closely tied to a loyalist colonel who personally vouched for him. But the close shave shook the ring. Woodhull himself was now spooked, paranoid that the British would come back for him at any moment. Soon after this, another disturbing incident befell the ring. A letter mentioning Talmadge was intercepted by the British, alerting them to his role recruiting spies in New York. The British raided his camp for more information, but they only captured a few documents and Talmadge's horse. The documents alluded to a possible future agent who had not yet worked for the Patriots. Despite these close calls, the ring expanded its operation in 1779. Talmadge chose somebody who was a pillar of the local community, a man named Robert Townsend, to take over some of the critical duties from the now twitchy Woodhull. Townsend lived in New York City, running a broad array of successful businesses frequented by loyalists and British soldiers. He was considered to be above suspicion, partially because he co-owned a popular loyalist coffee house. Townsend was not initially a patriot, but British soldiers had harassed his family, and New York's invasion had severely affected him. Despite his important role, Townsend demanded that his identity be kept secret, even from George Washington himself, so he came to be known as Sam Culper Jr. Townsend and others moved with ease among pro-British families during the war, and their intelligence was vital. For example, the team discovered that the British were artificially inflating the American currency to damage the economy by handing out counterfeit dollars. They also repeatedly informed General Washington of troop numbers, the names of commanding officers, and provided the dates and locations of future attacks. Although they did not always warn the Patriots in time, they did an excellent job of preparing Washington for the raids of the British commander, General Clinton, in the latter half of the war. On one occasion, the ring warned the French, who were arriving in Rhode Island to support the cause, of an imminent attack. Their speedy intelligence allowed the French and the Americans to prepare themselves and ultimately saved the day. Unfortunately, the Culper Ring's activities were eventually drastically affected by the terrible betrayal of Benedict Arnold. Arnold's defection to the British is legendary because he was once a respected American war hero and a patriot. After marrying a loyalist and being passed over for promotion, he switched sides. Washington had placed Arnold in charge of West Point, an essential fort in the state of New York, but Arnold was soon planning to hand the fort over to the British, an act which could have turned the tide of the war. Talmadge himself helped to bring Arnold down, as he already knew from his intelligence that somebody high up had betrayed the Patriot cause. While Arnold's treachery was discovered just in time, some of the intelligence he provided the British with was very damaging. The British immediately arrested a Patriot spy in New York on Arnold's information. The captured spy, a man named Mulligan, was an agent of Alexander Hamilton, but he also worked closely with the Culper Ring. The ring itself was thrown into disarray, as they had no way of knowing how many spies' names had been passed into British hands. The operation immediately ground to a halt. As it turned out, Talmadge had done a fantastic job of protecting their identities, and the ring members were in the clear. Although the Culper Ring briefly attempted to restart their activities, they soon ran into other difficulties. Late in the war, the Americans were running out of money, and Washington had stopped providing funds. The British had also stepped up their efforts to catch spies, creating extra military checkpoints and recruiting more agents of their own. From the summer of 1781, the Culper Ring ceased to send detailed reports to Washington. Woodhull and Townsend would only send occasional letters for most of the rest of the war. The team would make one final push in the closing months of the conflict, as Washington looked to secure the New York area. As the War for Independence drew to a close in 1783, the spies returned to their ordinary lives, and many never mentioned the ring again. Although many Culper Ring letters had survived, the ring's existence only became public knowledge in the 1930s. In recent years, the ring has become better known, largely thanks to the hugely popular AMC show Turn. Although the ring members were never recognized for the risks they took when they were alive, historians now frequently highlight the activities of the Culper Ring that helped to tip the balance in favor of the revolutionary cause. To learn more about the Culper Ring, check out our book, The Culper Ring, a captivating guide to George Washington's spy ring and its impact on the American Revolution.
So as you can see, there's many, many great tidbits in that video, starting with Nathan Hale, who was officially our country's first spy. working for the Knowlton Rangers. He was very brave, and he stepped up as the first person who went behind enemy lines in New York to try to spy on the British. And he did penetrate and get there, but then was caught for the reasons that you heard in the video. Unfortunately, was then hung. And Washington and his men were very depressed about that situation for a long time. It took them a long time to recover and figure out what they were going to do. But they did rebound, and they found a way to form the Culper Ring and several others like it throughout the colonies. And they did it in a way that was much safer, much better constructed, so that it would keep the operatives' identities hidden and would keep their methods hidden. And as you can see behind me, the symbol of the Culper Ring, they kicked off their activities in 1778, and they operated all the way till 1783. They were highly successful at their mission. And as we talked about, they had a number of very key plots that they busted through information. And really were sending reports on a weekly basis to Washington through their entire network. What was interesting was Washington insisted that he did not want to know the identities of the agents. In many cases, his head of intelligence, Talmadge, also did not know many of the agents that were working for him. Many of the agents didn't know who each other were throughout the network. And so it worked because they were able, if anyone were ever busted, they were able to have plausible deniability because they actually really didn't know who they were working with. So that was a really important part of why the Culper Spy Ring was so successful. You saw some of the other really great methods they used there. Invisible ink. The invisible ink they were using in 1779, they even improved on that. In 1780 and 1781, they were using invisible ink that you couldn't just warm up from behind with a candle anymore, but you actually had to have the right chemical to expose the lettering. And you saw that what they would do was they would take a innocuous letter or pamphlet, and they would write the secret letters and words in between those lines in invisible ink so that the receiver on the other side could decode that letter. So really, really cool stuff that they were doing. In the end, the Culper Ring had set up a system that worked really, really well. You heard that they had a boatman that we'll talk about a little bit later come to George Washington and say that he thought he could transport the messages across the water from New Jersey and Long Island, New York to Connecticut, which is where Washington and his men were stationed and had their headquarters. So Caleb Brewster was that boatman. It was really his idea. And out of his idea and his meetings with Talmadge came the idea behind the Culper Spy Ring. So really cool stuff there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go take a look at the 25 little known facts about the spies of the American Revolution. I hope you enjoy this and that it really makes you want to dig into more of the Culper Spy Ring, Knowlton's Rangers, and many of the other rings that were available back then, the key role that they played in our success in getting our independence as a country. All right, so number one, George Washington was our first spy master. He was known as Agent 711 in the Culper Spy Ring. And as you can see there on the left, name George Washington, his code number 711, position spy master. So under Washington's astute watch, several networks of spies operated in both close-knit circles and far-reaching societies. The undercover agents were merchants and tailors and farmers and other extraordinary patriots with ordinary day jobs. Much as with modern-day operatives, the members of these networks kept at a distance from one another and maintained secret identities. In some cases, Washington himself didn't even know who the identities of these men and women were, in secret to aid the cause of freedom. Washington had learned the hard way in the 7 Years' War as a British officer the importance of intelligence and understanding enemies' troop strengths and movements. In that war, they had often been fighting blind and paid dearly for it. So you can see the reason why he talked to Congress and his men to convince them of the importance of these spy rings. Number two, Nathan Hale was America's first spy. We heard a little bit about Nathan in the video. Hale was part of Knowlton's Rangers, which was the first organized intelligence service of the USA, led by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton. Washington called for a spy behind enemy lines, and Hale was the only volunteer to go. He was ferried across Long Island Sound to Huntington, New York, on the British-controlled Long Island. Hale planned to disguise himself as a Dutch school teacher looking for work. Robert Rogers of the Queen's Rangers saw Hale in a tavern and recognized him, and his Rangers apprehended Hale in Queens, New York, and handed him to the British. Hale was hung a day later without trial. So really a tragedy there, as you can see the picture there of him about to be hung. Washington learned many valuable lessons from this incident and determined that all his spy networks going forward must be better hidden. There's a Nathan Hale plaque on Yale University's campus as well. And there's also a statue in front of the CIA headquarters in Virginia as a tribute to our nation's first spy. His last words, as you heard in the video, were, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for our country." Pretty cool picture there of Nathan. He was actually on the first half-cent stamp. Number 3, Major Benjamin Talmadge created the Culper Spy Ring, operating out of New York at Washington's request. As we heard earlier, he worked with Brewster, who was the boatsman, and they came up with this idea to have this ring and to have this circuit where they would take in information out of New York City and flow it all the way up to Connecticut. So Talmadge was a veteran of multiple Continental Army campaigns, as well as one of George Washington's officers. He was a native New Yorker, and he had a big grudge against the British. He was classmates at Yale with the late Nathan Hale, so he had a little bit of a grind there as well. His brother perished on the notorious British prison ship HMS New Jersey, which grew his hatred for the crown even more. He formed the Culper Spy Ring after Washington's request by recruiting friends and acquaintances to take part. He would lead raids on British troops based on intelligence gained by the ring. He would often pick up spy documents from his informants himself and then decode the information. And so sometimes when it was boated across to Connecticut, he would actually be there to meet Brewster and pick up the documents. Other times he would send some of his operatives, but for the most part, he was very involved in the daily operations of this ring. You can see his code name and numbers there. His code name was John Bolton. His code number was 721. And his position was Chief of Intelligence for George Washington. So he really was kind of the head guy for this operation. Number 4, Samuel Culper Sr., as you heard in the video, was the alias for the leader of the Culper Spy Ring. So Abraham Woodhull, who was actually a friend of Talmadge, went by the pseudonym Samuel Culper Sr., and he was a farmer whose property was on the north side of Long Island, and he was the lead agent for Culper Spy Ring and associate of Talmadge. They knew each other since they were boys. Abraham Woodhull was a Setauket farmer whose family had lived in the area since 1657, and he knew the land very well. As you can see down on the bottom left there, that was the family farm in Setauket of the Woodhulls. He had suffered much at the hands of the British. His cousin had suffered and died in British captivity during the war. His father had been beaten up by the Queen's Rangers, so he had a real axe to grind with the British as well. He operated in New York City to gather information on British troop movements and would bring the information back to his home in Long Island to be delivered to Talmadge and Washington in Connecticut. His farm was perfectly located to be this transfer point. As you can see, his code book entry there, Abraham Woodhull, Samuel Culper Sr. His number was 722, and he was the head spy. Number 5, Robert Townsend was Samuel Culper Jr. in the Culper Spy Ring. A tip or piece of intelligence would originate when Robert Townsend, or Samuel Culper Jr., he was a loyalist coffee shop owner in New York City and society reporter, and he would often pass along scoop he overheard at gatherings of the British elite. He was really kind of in the perfect place in New York City to be the ear to the ground for this Culper Spy Ring, or the tip of the spear, as they say. He was a former Yale graduate and was in the Queen's Rangers as a captain before he decided to join the colonialist cause. So the British assumed that he was a loyalist. He also was, of course, a coffee shop owner that was a loyalist coffee shop, and they never thought he would be part of the Patriots. Even though he was a silent partner in the coffee shop with James Rivington, He later recruited Rivington to also join the cause and help the colonials. Rivington also published a local loyalist newspaper in New York City, at which Townsend worked as a local reporter, a position that he also used to gather information on British troop movements and plans. So he had kind of the perfect cover. He was both a reporter for a loyalist newspaper and also the part owner of a coffee shop. You can see his book entry there, Robert Townsend, Samuel Culper Jr. His number was 723, and he was the spy actually in downtown New York City. Number 6, James Rivington, who he recruited, we just talked about. He was the loyalist printer turned spy. Rivington was actually born in London, so he was British born, to a family of publishers. He was named by the King of England as the Royal Printer of New York during the Revolutionary War in 1775. So that was a big honor back then. His Royal Gazette, which you can see down there on the left, a copy of the Royal Gazette paper he printed. It became one of the best-selling newspapers in the colonies, often considered the first daily newspaper to be published in the United States. He was also a large bookseller in the colonies. He had a string of bookstores in New York State. So he began the war as a Tory or a loyalist, very loyal to the crown, and someone who wanted to be loyal and keep the American colonies as part of England. But in 1781, he began to work as a spy for General George Washington, the Culper Spy Ring, after being recruited by Robert Townsend. Rivington's work for the Patriot cause was not known during his lifetime. However, he died poor and unrecognized. His role was much more significant than originally thought, as he provided cover for the intelligence gathering operations in New York City. And there's a lot of writings about some of the other things that he did in printing codes within his newspaper for people to take a look at on the other side and translate. So he actually used his newspaper in a way to translate codes. Number 7, Jonas Hawkins was the first message writer for Washington's spy ring. In December 1778, General George Washington's chief of intelligence and Culper Spy Ring spy master, Major Benjamin Talmadge, recruited Jonas Hawkins as a clandestine courier to bring messages to Setauket from New York City. So as things were being gathered by Robert Townsend and his little group there, they would hand that off to Jonas Hawkins. He would hop on his horse and bring the messages all the way to Setauket. And he would hand it to Abraham Woodhull, who of course was the group's leader in gathering all the information. From there, the coded correspondence could be relatively easily forwarded to Talmadge in Connecticut. And of course, we know that that was done via boat by Caleb Brewster. At first, the ring employed just Hawkins in the role, but in the early summer, Austin Rowe had joined the group as an alternate writer. And Austin Rowe actually learned from Jonas Hawkins how to do this particular ride, which was a total of 55 miles or 89 kilometers between the two locations. At the time, both cities were occupied by the British, so this was a very dangerous ride. Often you'd have to come up on a British checkpoint. You had to have some excuse about what you were doing and where you were going. You can see Jonas Hawkins's home there on the right in Setauket. Number 8, Austin Rowe, who we just mentioned, joined the Culper Spy Ring as an alternate courier. He joined Jonas Hawkins as a writer to be able to carry coded messages from New York City to Long Island to be transferred over to the Continental Army in Connecticut. Rowe and Hawkins passed messages from New York City to Operative Caleb Brewster on Long Island, and Brewster would then take them across the Sound on his whaleboat to Talmadge at Fairfield, Connecticut. From there, Talmadge forwarded the messages to Washington. Rowe claimed to be conducting business as a merchant in order to avoid suspicion and pass through British checkpoints. Rowe became the sole dispatch rider for the ring in late 1779 when Talmadge gave Rowe, but not Hawkins, a code number in his code index. Hawkins' increasing paranoia led him to abandon the mission at the time. So essentially, Hawkins did it for about a year, but for the rest of the time they operated, everything was handed over to Austin Rowe as the primary rider. You can see his entry there in the code book. Austin Rowe, he was number 724, and he was a courier. Number 9, Caleb Brewster was the Culper Spy Ring's boatman. We've mentioned him a couple times here. There's a picture of him there in the top left, and there's a picture of him from the TV series Turn that we'll talk about here in a minute. And you heard it mentioned in the video And that's a copy on the right side there of what the whaleboats looked like back then. That's how big they would be. And as you can see, he would have to row it across that sound, often with 2 or 3 other men to help him. So he was a member of the Culper Spy Ring during the American Revolutionary War, reporting directly to George Washington through Major Benjamin Talmadge. He carried messages across the Long Island Sound on his whaleboat between Talmadge and the Ring's main spies on Long Island. He also made direct reports sometimes directly to Washington concerning naval activities in New York City area and in the Bay. He ran regular trips in whaleboats across the Sound on a variety of smuggling and military missions, typically doing it 2 to 3 times a week. So you can see this almost became a full-time job for him, running back and forth between the two areas of the Culper Spy Ring. Number 10, Anna Strong, the first female we mentioned in the Culper Spy Ring. She was a key member of the Culper Spy Ring, and the big question is, was she Agent 355? And you might have heard Agent 355 mentioned in the video as this mysterious agent that has never been fully explained who it is. Some people think it might have been Anna Strong. So Anna Smith Strong of Setauket, New York, was an American patriot, and she was one of the only female members of the Culper Spy Ring. Her role in the ring was to relay signals to courier Caleb Brewster, who ran the whaleboat across Long Island Sound on smuggling and military operations. She did this by hanging a black petticoat, as you can see there in the picture, on her clothesline, which was easily visible from the boat in the Sound. Also by Woodall and his nearby farm. So she and Woodall were friends, and Woodall could also see when the black petticoat was up there. When that black petticoat was there, it meant that there was information to be picked up by the whaleboat. She would also add a number of handkerchiefs, as you see there on the right. There were 6 different coves that Brewster would come into to pick up the information on a daily basis. And as you see there, she has 4 handkerchiefs up. So what she's letting Brewster know there is that he needs to come to cove number 4 to come do the pickup. So a pretty ingenious way of displaying your information in a way that seems very innocuous to the British. Rumors have swirled for many years that Anna was the secret Agent 355, whose identity was never known and has never been confirmed. And that certainly is a possibility. There's a number of other people that it possibly could be. I think actually it's more likely that it's one of the other people that is down in New York City that was Agent 355 from the research that I've done. But again, really fascinated to see if they ever get to the bottom of who it actually was. But she was a key member of this team. Number 11, Sarah Sally Townsend was another critical member of the Culper Spy Ring. And there's actually a really great book by Dorothy Horton Millay there, as you can see, called Sally Townsend, Patriot. She was only 17 years old when she started her spy ring activities. She was the younger sister of Robert Townsend, who of course was the main gatherer of information in New York City. She was a very attractive and vivacious girl. She earned the affections of Lieutenant John Graves Simcoe, who succeeded command of the Queen's Rangers from Robert Rogers. So he was essentially the head of that intelligence unit for the British. Simcoe established his headquarters in the Townsend home, and he was often visited by British Army's Adjutant General John Andre. Young Sally used her influence over him to gain British secrets, which she then passed on to her brother. Sally told Robert about how she overheard Simcoe and Andre discussing plans to capture West Point, thanks to Benedict Arnold's treachery. So you can see she busted one of the biggest plots in the entire war, and that was outing John Andre and Benedict Arnold, both of them. Rumors have swirled for many years that Sally also might be the secret Agent 355, whose identity was never known. I think it's probably more likely that she was the Agent 355 from the research I've done, because she was very close to the information that Agent 355 was providing. And she was in that house where much of the intelligence work was being done. But again, it'll be really interesting to see as historians continue to dig into this mystery. This is the route of intelligence through the Culper Spy Ring. As you can see here, on the bottom down left bottom, there's New York City, where Robert Townsend and Sally Townsend were gathering information and passing it on to the riders that we talked about, Austin Rowe. He would pick it up. He would ride it the 55 miles all the way over to Setauket, where we had Abraham and Anna waiting on him. They would pick it up, they would package it up, and they would do the signal over to Caleb Brewster, who would then load the information onto pallets on his whaleboat, and he would take the whaleboat across the Sound to Connecticut at the weakest spot with the least British activity. I will say, in reading about Caleb Brewster, though, he was very brave because there was always British activity on the Sound at all times. So he had to find different times of the day and night to try to go across the Sound, even though he was going in what was the weakest spot. Once he reached Fairfield, Connecticut, he would meet up with Talmadge and his operatives, hand over all the information to them, and then they would ride the rest of the way to George Washington at his headquarters to provide the information. So you can see a very ingenious way that they were gathering information in New York City and getting it to where it needed to go. Number 12, Elizabeth Bergen was a spy and operative. She was an American patriot during the American Revolutionary War who helped over 200 prisoners of war escape from British warships. Bergen brought food for prisoners of war housed on British prison ships in New York. In 1779, she was approached by George Higday, a member of the Culper Spy Ring, to help prisoners of war escape the prison ships. Sometime later, the British intercepted a letter from George Washington to Benjamin Talmadge, which talked about Higday's espionage. And on July 13th of 1779, Higday's home was raided by the British and they arrested him. Higday's wife, in order to help her husband, told the British about Bergen. As a result, British authorities attempted to locate her and placed a bounty of 200 pounds on her head. Bergen hid for 2 weeks before moving to Long Island, and then she hid for another 5 weeks in Long Island, and then eventually moved to Connecticut and finally Philadelphia. So she was kind of outrunning the British to make sure she didn't get captured. In October 1779, Bergen received a flag of truce from the Board of War in order for her to get her children from New York all the way to Philadelphia to join her. However, she was not allowed to take any of her clothes or any of her furniture. So she essentially had nothing with her when she got to Philadelphia. And since she had nothing, she received an annuity from Congress starting in 1781 and claimed the funds all the way until 1787. So you can see from 1781 to 1787, she was on the government pension. Number 13, George Higday was an informant for the Culper Spy Ring. So in the spring of 1779, several Patriot officers were escaping from British captivity. George Higday assisted these men in crossing the river to freedom. Word got back to George Washington about his heroism, and he wrote to Benjamin Talmadge, who was in the process of forming the Culper Spy Ring, and informed him that Higday may be helpful. Just after receiving the general's update, Talmadge's camp was attacked by British who seemed to have known that he was involved with Patriot espionage. And although he survived the skirmish, the Redcoats made off with Talmadge's horse. In the saddle of the horse was the letter from Washington, which mentioned George Higday by name. So Higday was then arrested in his home by the British. He wrote a confession, although that confession was coerced, stating that he was just trying to make some money to invest in his farm. The most important part of Higday's story was its effect on the Culper Spy Ring. Washington and Talmadge realized how easily their secret information could get out. And as a result, they came up with a now famous cipher and code book for passing intelligence covertly. You can see the picture there of Higday being arrested in his home and his wife there pleading for him not to be killed. And then the code book and the cipher that resulted from this action. Essentially, the spy ring became much better and much more clandestine because they realized they couldn't just leave letters out in the open like they had before. Number 14, who was the secret Agent 355? We mentioned this a couple times already. The only mention that they found in the documents was that she did die after 1780, and that 355 was the code name for a female spy during the American Revolution as part of the Culper Spy Ring. You can see there on the left, 355 in the code book equated to lady, Lady, not a specific name. So again, we don't know the identity of this person, but we have some suspicions. Agent 355's contributions to the Culper Spy Ring were instrumental to success. This individual operated within British-controlled territory. She gathered valuable intelligence on troop movements, supply routes, strategic military plans. Agent 355 transmitted vital information through the Culper network, enabling George Washington to make informed decisions and often prove decisive on the battlefield. The way her code is constructed indicates she may have had some degree of social prominence. She was living in New York City at the time, and at some point had had contact with Major John Andre and Benedict Arnold, and she outed them both. One person who has been named as possible identity, Agent 355, as we mentioned, was Anna Strong, who was Woodhull's neighbor. My suspicion about this rumor, though, I think is not true, is because Anna lived 55 miles away in Setauket and not in downtown New York City, which is where all of 355's information was coming from. Another theory is that Agent 355 may have been Robert Townsend's common-law wife at the time. Other possible candidates were Sally Townsend, his sister, or Elizabeth Bergen, who we mentioned earlier was the woman who was helping men get off the shifts. So all of those possibilities are there as the possible secret Agent 355. I'll mention that there's a new series coming out called The 355, which is a series by the Jason Bourne producers about female spies from the CIA. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they use the inspiration of Agent 355 for that TV series. Number 15, the Culper Spy Ring was named after Culpeper County, Virginia, in the town of Culpeper. And you can see there the seal of the town of Culpeper and where it's located in the state of Virginia. The Culper Ring was a network of spies active during the American Revolution, organized by Major Benjamin Talmadge and General George Washington in 1778 during the British occupation of New York City. The name Culper was suggested by George Washington and taken from Culpeper County, Virginia, where he had done a lot of his land surveyor work before the war. And you'll see a picture there of George Washington doing his land surveying work, which he did all over Virginia, and Culpeper being one of those places. So interesting how they came up with the name. Number 16, the AMC TV series Turn is about the Culper Spy Ring. As we heard in the video, they talked about this really exciting series. I watched a couple of episodes in getting ready for this program today, and it's fantastic. The acting is great. The production is great. The way they filmed it is really fantastic. They stuck very close to the story, didn't try to embellish it. So definitely highly recommend you check out this great spy series, Turn. Based on Alexander Rose's book, The Washington Spies, The Story of America's First Spy Ring. Really excellent book as well, highly recommended. The show delves into the untold story of America's first spy ring, which played a crucial role during the American Revolution. The Culper Ring consisted of a group of childhood friends from Long Island who became unlikely spies and ultimately helped turn the tide in America's fight for independence, which really was true. You can see a picture of Woodhull there in the bottom and a picture of Anna Strong there in the top, in the lower right. So highly recommend you check this series out. Number 17, Continental Army had its own intelligence unit formed in 1776 before the Culper Ring, and it was known as Knowlton's Rangers, which was a reconnaissance and espionage detachment from the Continental Army established by Thomas Knowlton. On August 12, 1776, General of the Army George Washington promoted Knowlton to lieutenant colonel. He was ordered to select a group of 130 men and 20 officers from Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts regiments to carry out reconnaissance missions on behalf of the Continental Army. The famous American spy, Captain Nathan Hale of Coventry, Connecticut, was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton. So, as we mentioned earlier, Hale, being our first spy, was part of Knowlton's Rangers. Besides providing tactical intelligence, Knowlton's Rangers outfitted as a regiment of light infantry as well, and took part in several battles of the American Revolutionary War, including the Battle of Harlem Heights and the Battle of Fort Washington. And that is actually why Knowlton's Rangers are now considered to be the predecessor to our modern special forces units, such as Army Rangers, Delta Force, and other special operations units. And you can see the seal down at the bottom right there of the United States Army Intelligence Seal. They consider their foundation to be 1776, even though they're operating today, because of Knowlton's Rangers. And you can see what one of the Knowlton's Rangers would have looked like there in the middle. That was their uniform. Wasn't quite like the rest of the Continental Army. It was more like a operative's uniform for the field. Number 18, George Washington had many different spy networks across the states. Under resolutions passed by Congress, military intelligence operations branched out in several directions, north and south. The young country was spending a full 11% of its budget on intelligence efforts. Small, nimble networks evolved, providing Washington with vital information. The general deployed his own agents, such as Hercules Mulligan, a tailor who could easily conceal and deliver messages through his business. Double agents were also afoot, often classified as deserters so that they could more readily siphon off information from the British. These double agents, the British thought were harmless and would often tell them things. The tools and tactics his spies used were in many cases downright revolutionary. They utilized a variety of methods to maintain secrecy and gather intelligence, including not knowing who each other were. So they had plausible deniability, using code names, using ciphers and book codes, locations of dead drops, trap doors. You can see there on the lower left, one of the trap doors that was used for spy drops. Clothesline codes, which we heard from Anna Strong, propaganda. Invisible inks were designed to respond to fire or acid, and they were frequently used to send messages. George Washington actually sought the help of James Jay, which was John Jay's brother, to develop the ink that would only be visible through a chemical reaction. So pretty cool that James Jay was part of that process. As one defeated British officer was quoted as saying, Washington did not really outfight the British, he simply outspied us. And we mentioned that earlier, that we definitely would not have been successful in our effort without spying. You can see top left there is the chemical reaction being applied to the paper so that the words will show up. And then in the middle there, that is a cipher that was used to decipher codes when they were written in numbers or letters so that you could figure out what was being said. Number 19, black spies were very active in the Revolutionary War. African Americans, both free and enslaved, had difficult choices to make during the era of the Revolution. Some chose to support the British, while others fought with or supported patriot armies. It's not difficult to imagine enslaved men and women working in their homes where officers and soldiers and political elite freely discussed their plans within earshot of an enslaved person. But they were not simply passive bystanders. They shared the information that they heard. Some historians credit an enslaved man named Quaco in Newport, Rhode Island, as being the first African-American spy of the Revolution. The intelligence given by Quaco to the Continental Army enabled the raid of Newport, Rhode Island to be successful, and he was given a full commendation and his freedom by the state of Rhode Island. Perhaps the most well-known black spy of the American Revolution was James Armistead Lafayette. French General Marquis de Lafayette recruited him to spy for the Patriots in the summer of 1781. And with the permission of the Americans, James infiltrated General Cornwallis's camp at Yorktown. James may have pretended to be a runaway slave seeking his freedom with the British Army. He earned Cornwallis's trust and found himself in a situation to be able to look at the general's papers. He took note of troop size and health, morale of the soldiers, and communicated all he learned back to Lafayette. At the end of the war, he was granted a position as Continental soldier. So really amazing, some of the true contributions that these African-American spies made on behalf of the Continental Army. Number 20, Benedict Arnold. He was a name synonymous with treason and traitor. You can see a picture of him there in the Continental uniform before he switched to the British. In the early years of the Revolutionary War, Benedict Arnold was one of George Washington's most accomplished field generals, having won battles at Ridgefield and Saratoga, making him one of the famous patriots in the country. As a matter of fact, many people knew Benedict Arnold more than they knew George Washington, believe it or not. He had had such a huge effect on the country as a patriot. At Saratoga, he was injured, and to facilitate his recuperation, Washington appointed him military governor of Philadelphia. He became disaffected over time with the war effort after Congress passed him over for promotion and gave several junior officers in his area promotions. So that really ticked him off. In addition, his wife, Margaret Peggy Shippen, was immersing herself into lavish spending and made him deeply in debt. Adding to the swirl of troubles, Arnold then faced court-martial on charges of misconduct and financial impropriety. Though he was exonerated in that court-martial, he received a stinging rebuke from Washington, and that made him have deep resentment towards the colonial cause. So bitter and indignant and desperate for money, Arnold decided to turn away from his country, and he brokered a secret deal with the British to begin spying for them. In 1780, Washington summoned Arnold to rejoin the army as top commander, but the disillusioned general had other plans. He requested and was granted command of the American defenses along the Hudson River at West Point, which was one of our most important forts and positions. Arnold, now branded the most notorious traitor in American history, and after he had a failed attempt to trade the vital American outpost at West Point for cash, it resulted in his defection to the British side, a plot that was foiled by information coming from the Culper Spy Ring and Agent 355. So pretty cool. He was outed by 355 in the Culper Spy Ring and ended up having to flee for his life and join the British. Number 21, Peggy Shippen, the socialite and accomplished. We just mentioned her. She was born into a renowned Philadelphia family. She was beautiful and politically astute, surrounded by people of influence at a young age. In 1777, the 17-year-old began a long friendship with British Major John Andre, and he was the general and intelligence chief to the British General Sir Henry Clinton, who was George Washington's counterpart. That same year, she was also introduced to Benedict Arnold. She ended up marrying the American general 2 years later. Her friendship with Andre allowed Shippen to easily connect him to her husband, Benedict Arnold. By some accounts, it was Shippen who encouraged Arnold to consider siding with the British and leaving his country. She also relayed communications between the two officers, sometimes crafting the messages herself and even sometimes doing them in code. It was through these communications that the pair devised their scheme for Arnold to request command of West Point. Following Andre's capture, Shippen was informed of her husband's treachery but claimed ignorance and feigned a hysterical state. Later banished from Philadelphia, she was permitted to reunite with Arnold, and in the wake of the final British defeat, the couple moved to London for the rest of their lives. It's very interesting. She was really operating on behalf of the British, and at the end of the war had to flee with her husband. 22, John Andre, who we just mentioned. He was an officer, a gentleman, and a spy master. So in 1779, the 29-year-old Andre began a secret correspondence with American General Benedict Arnold at the urging of Peggy Shippen, Arnold's wife, a year before Arnold was placed in command of the West Point position. The British were aiming to seize control of the region, effectively cutting off New England from the other colonies. By that time, Arnold, a hero of previous battles, was feuding with the Continental Congress and souring on the American cause. In a midnight meeting with Andre at the house on the banks of the Hudson River, Arnold agreed to surrender West Point to the British for 20,000 pounds, an amount equal to nearly $4 million today. Arnold provided sensitive notes about the West Point fortifications, which Andre hid in his boot. On his return to British headquarters, Andre was captured by 3 local American militia who discovered the incriminating documents in his boot. You can see the picture there on the top left. Those are the 3 gentlemen who stopped Andre and inspected him and found the documents. The militia commander notified the Continental Army, and fortuitously, it was Major Benjamin Talmadge, Washington's spy chief, who received the report. Immediately recognizing Arnold's treachery, Talmadge advised the militia commander to forward the captured documents to Washington. Although his captors found Andre charming, he was ordered to be hung after a days-long trial. And you can see his hanging there on the bottom left. 23, Ann Bates, the school teacher spy. She was a Philadelphia school teacher with loyalist sympathies. Ann Bates was one of the most successful British spies of this war. Her espionage began in 1778, shortly after she accompanied her husband, a British soldier and gunsmith, to his post in New York. At the British camp, she met Major Duncan Drummond, the intelligence chief for the British commanding general who preceded Major John Andre in that capacity. Drummond proposed to employ Bates as a spy for the British Army. Even with limited training, Bates managed to gain access to Washington's headquarters on multiple occasions. She was disguised as a peddler. She roamed freely through the Continental Army camp in White Plains, New York, eavesdropping on conversations among the officers and enlisted men. She would stay in loyalist safe houses while traveling to and from the Continental camps. Following one such mission in 1778, Bates warned the British about Continental troops advancing towards Rhode Island, which spoiled the Americans' plan at that time. Bates' espionage ended in 1780 when her husband subsequently abandoned her. Facing financial hardship, the American-born Bates convinced the British government to provide her with a small pension as payment for her wartime spying. So this is an example of an American woman schoolteacher who flipped and was helping the British. Number 24, Queen's American Rangers was a British intelligence unit on Long Island, New York. So very similar on the American side to Knowlton's Rangers, which Nathan Hale had been part of. Queen's American Rangers was the British version of this. Widely revered for his exploits during the French and Indian War, where he fought alongside the British Army and American colonists, Major Robert Rogers, a picture of him there on the top left, was a skilled and imaginative guerrilla warfare fighter. His innovative tactics remain a part of U.S. Army Ranger Handbook today. Early in the Revolutionary War, Rogers volunteered his services to George Washington, who turned him away, unconvinced of the man's loyalty and character. Rogers then approached the British, who agreed to employ their former ally as a lieutenant colonel and authorized him to raise a battalion of Loyalist Rangers in Long Island. The unit became known as Queen's American Rangers, a counter-espionage force that operated throughout Long Island and the greater region. Though he managed to capture the American spy Nathan Hale and executed many other daring missions, Rogers never reclaimed his stature from the previous war, and then eventually fell out of favor with his British superiors. After he left service with the Queen's American Rangers, the unit continued until the official end of the war in 1783. So you can see he was very instrumental in getting that unit spun up, but it did continue even after he left. 25, Thomas Hickey and the Plot Against Washington. In June 1776, George Washington ordered the arrest of David Matthews, who was a loyalist mayor of New York City, for conspiring in support of British plans to invade the city and strike the Continental Army there. It was later learned that Matthews was also involved in a devious plot against Washington, along with William Tryon, the British-appointed governor of New York. The conspirators aimed to capture or assassinate Washington using traitors in his lifeguard. And of course, the lifeguard at that time was the detachment of soldiers responsible for the general safety. Essentially, this was the precursor to today's Secret Service. Their sole objective at the time was to take care of George Washington. So they were foiled by the Committee for Detecting and Defeating Conspiracy, led by John Jay, who would later gain fame as a founding father. Thomas Hickey, the Continental soldier at the center of the plot, was a favorite of Washington. He was an Irishman, a British Army deserter. Hickey joined the colonial militia in Connecticut and was later handpicked by Washington to join his elite lifeguard. Hickey proved a disappointment and was later jailed on suspicion of counterfeiting. While detained, he confided to fellow prisoners that he was turning his back on the cause of independence and that he had actively recruited others to support the British and that he was part of the plot to kill Washington. Hickey was hung for his treason a year later. So you can see there was always plots on both sides to try to take out the leaders of the other side. Thomas Hickey paid for his treason. Revolutionary spy technology. This was a really interesting one I was researching. This submarine was actually created during the war. The initial prototype of it was in 1775. This was called the American Turtle. It was a submersible vessel shaped rather like a giant acorn. It was constructed in 1775 by David Bushnell. It was 7.5-foot long pod used in 1776 to attach explosives to the hull of the British flagship Eagle, which was docked in the New York harbor. So really fascinating. You can see the little turbines there. The individual who was piloting this little vessel would try to row his feet against the pedals to make the turbines go. It would make this little vessel go skim along the water up into the ship, and then he would place the explosives. He actually did place the explosives in this case, but unfortunately it did not sink the ship. The explosives went off to no avail, did not really do very much to the ship, but really a brilliant idea along the lines of something had never been thought before, and that was a submarine called the American Turtle. So as you can see, so many innovative and amazing techniques and sources and methods that we used back then during the American Revolution to gain victory. We would never have gotten as far as we did without the information, without the misinformation, the propaganda, the informants, the drops in the middle of the night, the taking of the information from New York City all the way to Connecticut to Washington and his men so they can make major decisions. And such a fascinating time and fascinating subject. I hope you enjoyed that very much, and I hope you'll take some time to like this video and subscribe. We have many more great videos coming your way. We have one we're researching now, we'll be doing very soon, about the spies of the American Civil War, which is just as fascinating a topic as this one. But I hope you enjoyed this and that you'll take some time to really dig into this topic. There's so much more to learn about the spies of the American Revolution. Hope you have a fantastic evening. Thanks so much.